For some analysis, we're now joined by the founder and director of Restless Beings, a UK-based human rights group. We speak to Mabrur Ahmed. Mabrur, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you as well. Good evening.
So, what's your take on the first 100 days of the Taliban government?
Pretty much as expected, I think. We've obviously seen severe rights, or rights severely being restricted. You mentioned about women and to an extent, the allowance, if you like, of women on TV, be it with a headscarf or not, is just symbolic. The greater repercussion isn't in a public life. It's not in the public sphere, but it's in private life and in the homes and villages and towns across Afghanistan. And I think, obviously, girls' education has been restricted. Secular education, as you may call it, is also restricted. But the underlying factor here is a lot of mismanagement. Countries pulling out of any investment that they had within Afghanistan means that there's huge food insecurity. It's going to take something like $2 billion to get about half of the population, about 25 million people, out of food insecurity within a couple of months' time. So we're talking about a crisis unfolding in front of our eyes, and one which is entirely predictable, and unfortunately, it seems at this moment in time, there's nothing that can happen until and unless there's a bit more kind of opening up of Afghanistan to the international arena.
One gets a sense that if the status quo doesn't change, Afghanistan is going to become donor dependent, and that nothing else really is going to grow the country's economy and create a space where Afghan people can thrive.
Well, I think it's interesting what you just mentioned there about Afghanistan potentially being a donor-dependent country, but the fact of the matter is that there are no donors that are looking to help Afghanistan at this moment in time. And that's obviously got a lot to do with those in power. The Taliban are not exactly a party or a power structure that anyone else wants to be seen doing legitimate business with, or whether that's even in a humanitarian capacity or in an industrial capacity. What you mentioned in terms of the economy growing or even just staying as it is, the status quo, if you like, that's also not happening. We're seeing huge rises in fuel, for example. I think I read somewhere recently that the fuel prices have rocketed up to about 70% of what they were around about August time.
So what needs to happen? Does one recognize the Afghan government, the Taliban, or, as a lot of countries are doing, they're waiting to see, but what are they waiting for?
Well, I think that's the key word. It's a waiting game, because, I think to a large extent over the last sort of 2 decades, 20 years or so, with the US occupation of Afghanistan, there has been the idea that Afghanistan could finally open up to some sort of, kind of globalized effort of capitalism, of investment, of growth of economy, and all of these kind of things. The waiting game is essentially to see whether or not the Taliban have changed. And I think it's very hard to find areas or notions even that the Taliban might have changed. I think there is obviously a slight change of tact in terms of strategy of how they come across on their PR, and possibly they may be saying and providing sound bites of things that seem a little bit more liberal or palatable to the global north and to the west. But the underbelly, the remaining fact is that the Taliban have got one major agenda, and that one major agenda is not going to work with potential foreign investors or donors. And that is, of course, the Islamization of Afghanistan to some degree, but also an authoritarian type of rule, with a one-party state, essentially, and it's not even really recognized as a party. It's more of a force, is not palatable to foreign investors, to countries, to states, And therefore, unfortunately, what that means is that any kind of donor that might have come forward, or any sort of food, any sort of stability that might have come through other countries providing support, is simply not there.
In the meantime, millions of people are at risk, and there was already a vulnerable situation for Afghan citizens before the Taliban took over, and now it just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. Surely the international community have to look beyond who's in charge and look at the faces of the citizens.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you're speaking to a human rights activist, and an activist is the key part of that term. It's the faces of the community, it's the faces of the individuals which matter more and above and beyond everything else. Unfortunately, you see, the thing is, the so-called international community, they're part of the reason why people are facing food insecurity. They're part of the reason, or the contributing reason, of why there's rising fuel prices and misery, therefore, on people's lives. It's the fact that what was there before in terms of investment, in terms of support, is no longer there, which has led to this insecurity, which has led to this price hikes, etc. That doesn't help with the fact that there's been a drought for the last number of months, that of course we're still going through a pandemic without any adequate support on a healthcare basis in Afghanistan. None of those things are dependent solely on the Taliban. Now, that obviously doesn't exonerate the Taliban of any fault and any blame. Of course, it's because of the way that they conduct their business, it's the way that they appear to be, and the lack of change from them that has kind of driven the international community away. But it's a difficult proposition, because sometimes we call for interventionism and sometimes we don't. At this moment in time, do we want the international community to step up to help Afghanistan? Absolutely. But can we avoid the fact that for the last 20 years it was occupied by so-called international community or actors in the international community? No, we can't deny that either. So it's six of one and half a dozen of another.
One of the tenets of Islam is charity and taking care of those in need. How is it that a country that's surrounded by predominantly Muslim countries are not getting aid?
You see, I think, I'm going to speak on this from an activist perspective, regardless of religion, which is, it's surrounded by countries, right? So if it's surrounded by countries which have also got human beings living in there, how can they not support those people who are separated by a border, whether that's political, strategic, or geographical? It baffles me. Yes, when you start talking about the tenements of faith, and you talk about Islam and the idea of a communal kind of wealth, and the idea of helping thy neighbor, etc., then it's even more concerning, it's even more alarming. I don't think the Taliban necessarily has supporters within the Islamic world either. And that's largely due to the way that they conduct their business, not necessarily even their end goal ambition. I don't think their end goal ambition of a sort of Islamization of Afghanistani territory is that different to many other so-called Islamic countries around the world. It's the way that they go about their business that sometimes perturbs others. I think also, when we're talking about a humanitarian level, really what we as observers, international community, or just well-wishers and lovers of humans essentially can hope for is that the Taliban themselves can find it within them to govern their country in a way which is governing, actually, and as opposed to grabbing of power. If they were able to enact basic principles of governance, basic principles of making sure that the population are able to go about their life in a somewhat decent way, then Afghanistan has enough, I wouldn't say riches, but it has enough character as a country to be able to bounce out of the situation that they find themselves in. But again, I would highly question whether or not the Taliban has that fortitude or even has that righteousness, because I think their agenda and that their goal is completely different to looking after its population. It's about power grab.
All right. Perhaps as a final question, as a human rights activist, We see these anecdotal things like, women being banned, being in television dramas and that kind of thing. What would you say has been the state of human rights in the first 100 days? Is it something that's looking like it's getting worse? What's your assessment?
Well, without a shadow of a doubt, it's getting worse, and it will get worse. If the Taliban are true to their form book, they will go back to a very repressive, oppressive style of ruling their country, which doesn't pay any heed for anyone's rights at all. It pays only the heed of those in power and their idea of righteousness. Whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about the LGBT community, whether we're talking about just labor rights. I recently did a television show where I was hosting a Q&A with a number of people, and we were talking about the notion of Afghanistan. I had an Afghanistani lecturer on the phone line, and I've spoken to this guy many times before. He's an amicable gentleman, but being in a public domain, he was giving very pro-Taliban answers, and I understand exactly the reason why, because otherwise he's going to be targeted. That might not necessarily appeal to the theme of human rights, but it definitely kind of plays into the idea of security, the idea of families being targeted, the idea of civilians being targeted, and that, of course, then does fall within the sphere of human rights. The human rights issues and the human rights situation in Afghanistan is not going to be good so long as the Taliban are there. But also, let's be sure to mention, they weren't exactly perfect, even with the occupation of the US. There's a lot that needs to happen for human rights to be respected in a territory like Afghanistan. And the very first thing is to go back to a constitution which puts the population at its foremost central part of that constitution. And I don't think the Taliban are interested in rewriting a constitution. They're just simply worried about holding on to whatever power that they can within the territory of Afghanistan.
Mabrur Ahmed, always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
All right, that's Mabrur Ahmed, who's the Director of Restless Beings, a UK-based human rights group, talking to us about the concerning situation in Afghanistan, a humanitarian crisis looming as hunger could be something that we see more and more of in that country in the coming weeks and months.